My neighbor called my garden a mess, but then she saw this. When Martha moved in next door, something shifted in our quiet street. She had this smile that never quite reached her eyes, the kind that whispered superiority with every curve. Within weeks, she became the queen of our neighborhood, hosting perfect garden parties and organizing community cleanups. Everyone adored her polished appearance and her immaculate lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Her roses stood in perfect rows, her hedges trimmed to mathematical precision. But whenever she looked at my yard, that smile turned into something else entirely. Something cold. I noticed it first during her welcome party, when she glanced past her fence and her expression flickered with judgment. My garden was different from hers, wild, overgrown, full of mismatched plants and experimental corners. I loved every chaotic inch of it. But Martha? She saw only disorder. And she made it her mission to let everyone know that the neighborhood had one glaring imperfection: me. The first direct insult came on a Tuesday morning. I was watering my tomato plants when I heard her voice drift over the fence, sharp and unmistakable. "Rebecca, your garden looks like it's been through a hurricane." I looked up to find Martha standing at the property line, arms crossed, surveying my yard with the scrutiny of a health inspector. Her perfectly pressed linen shirt didn't have a single wrinkle. Her hair sat in an elegant bun without a strand out of place. And there she stood, dissecting my sanctuary with her eyes. I forced a smile. "I like the natural look," I replied. She laughed, a thin, cutting sound that echoed in my chest long after she walked away. It wasn't the friendly chuckle of a neighbor making conversation. It was performance, calculated and cruel. That laugh told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about gardening preferences. This was war. By Friday, I knew the damage had spread beyond that fence. I was at the corner store when I overheard Martha talking to Mrs. Lorne near the dairy section. "Poor Rebecca," she said with mock sympathy dripping from every word. "Her backyard looks like a compost heap pretending to be art. I don't know how anyone can live like that." Mrs. Lorne murmured something I couldn't hear. I stood frozen between the milk cartons and the yogurt, my hand gripping the shopping basket until my knuckles turned white. Heat flooded my face. My garden wasn't just plants to me, it was therapy, memory, peace. Every flower had a story. Every corner represented a season of healing. And she reduced it to trash. That night, I stood in my backyard with pruning shears in hand, seriously considering tearing everything down. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was the neighborhood eyesore. The following Wednesday, everything escalated. A city vehicle pulled up outside my house, and a uniformed inspector stepped out holding a clipboard. My heart dropped into my stomach as he introduced himself and explained that someone had filed a sanitation complaint about my property. A complaint about my garden. The inspector was professional and kind, acknowledging that while my yard was unconventional, it didn't violate any codes. But the damage was done. As he drove away, I looked toward Martha's house just in time to see her blinds snap shut. She'd been watching, waiting, probably hoping they'd cite me or fine me. That evening, my hands shook as I made tea. The humiliation burned deeper than anger. She hadn't just criticized me to neighbors, she'd involved authorities. She wanted me punished for not conforming to her vision of perfection. This wasn't about property values anymore. This was personal. I cried that night, sitting on my back porch with my knees pulled to my chest. Not gentle tears, but the kind that come from deep humiliation and exhaustion. The garden around me, once my refuge from the world's harshness, now felt like evidence of my failure. Every wilted leaf seemed to confirm Martha's accusations. Every overgrown vine looked like proof that I couldn't keep up. The fairy lights I'd strung between the trees blinked weakly, as if even they were embarrassed by the mess surrounding them. I thought about my late mother, who'd taught me to garden as a child, who'd always said that the most beautiful things grow wild. But her voice felt distant now, drowned out by Martha's cutting remarks and pitying looks from neighbors. Sleep wouldn't come that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling Martha's victory pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shift. She had won. Dawn broke gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. I dragged myself outside with coffee, intending to start pulling up plants, surrendering to Martha's campaign of shame. But as I stood there in the early light, something shifted. The morning sun caught the broken fountain I'd been meaning to fix, turning the cracked basin into something almost sculptural. Vines I'd considered weeds suddenly looked intentional, creating organic patterns across the fence. The scattered clay pots, mismatched and chipped, held a sort of rustic charm. And in that moment of soft light and quiet desperation, I saw it. Not a mess. Not a failure. A canvas. An opportunity. A story waiting to be told in glass and metal and living color. My pulse quickened. What if I leaned into the chaos instead of fighting it? What if I transformed this space into something so unexpected, so breathtaking, that Martha's pristine perfection would look boring by comparison? I became a woman possessed. That weekend, I started collecting things others had discarded. Old window frames from estate sales, rusted garden gates from the junkyard, colored glass bottles from recycling bins, broken tiles from renovation sites. My car filled with treasures that most people saw as trash. The neighbors noticed, of course. How could they not? I hauled metal scraps and mirrors through my front yard. Martha stood on her porch one afternoon, arms crossed, that superior smirk plastered across her face as I carried an old headboard past her perfect petunias. "Redecorating, Rebecca?" she called out, her voice dripping with barely concealed glee. "Building something new?" I replied without stopping. Let her think I'd lost my mind. Let her collect more ammunition for her gossip sessions. I worked until midnight every night that week, sketching plans, cutting metal, arranging glass. My hands developed calluses. My back ached. But for the first time in weeks, I felt alive. 2 weeks into my project, something strange happened. I woke at 2 a.m. to sounds outside my window, rustling, footsteps, the soft click of a phone camera. My blood went cold. I crept to the window and peered through the curtain. There, in my backyard, stood Martha in her silk robe, phone flashlight illuminating sections of my half-finished work. She was filming everything, documenting my madness for her collection of evidence. Rage replaced fear instantly. I threw on shoes and stormed outside. "Enjoying the view?" I called across the dark garden. She spun around, phone nearly slipping from her hand, her face a mask of shock and embarrassment. For once, perfect Martha looked flustered. The noise woke me," she stammered. "The noise?" I stepped closer. "Or your curiosity about what I'm building?" She retreated toward her gate without another word, but I saw her face in the moonlight. She wasn't just curious. She was threatened. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, official and threatening. The Homeowners Association had scheduled an inspection of my property due to multiple complaints regarding aesthetics and potential safety hazards. The hearing was set for 2 weeks away. Multiple complaints. Not just Martha anymore. She'd recruited others, or perhaps her constant criticism had finally convinced enough people that my garden was a genuine problem. My sister called that evening. "Is it true the HOA is coming after you?" News traveled fast in small communities. I confirmed it, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let them come," I said with more confidence than I felt. "I'll be ready." After I hung up, I stood in the backyard and looked at the walls of woven metal I'd constructed, the glass mosaics still in progress, the archway leading to the secret space only I knew about. 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks to finish what I'd started. I got to work. The next 14 days blurred into a frenzy of creation. I built walls from salvaged iron fencing, weaving them with copper wire until they formed intricate patterns that cast shadows like lace. Between the metal, I installed panels of colored glass that caught sunlight and scattered rainbows across the ground. The walkways became tunnels of living green, vines carefully trained to create natural archways overhead. And at the heart of it all, I created something no one could see from the street, a hidden sanctuary accessible only through a narrow passage behind a wall of climbing roses. Inside that secret garden, I built a pond from an old clawfoot bathtub, filling it with water lilies and tiny fish. Mirrors of all sizes hung from trees and fence posts, strategically angled to multiply every flower, every beam of light. The effect was disorienting and magical. You couldn't tell where the garden ended and its reflection began. Word spread about my project, though no one had seen the finished result. "She's building a junkyard," I heard someone say at the grocery store. Another neighbor told my sister it looked like a witch's lair, all twisted metal and broken glass. The comments should have hurt, but they only fueled my determination. Martha, of course, was the ringleader of the criticism. She started a petition to preserve the neighborhood's character and property values, complete with photos of my yard taken from her upstairs window, photos that showed only piles of materials and construction chaos, deliberately framing everything in the worst possible light. 23 neighbors signed it. 23 people who'd never asked what I was creating, who judged based on Martha's narrative. The petition was scheduled for presentation at the same HOA meeting where my property would be inspected. Martha had orchestrated a perfectly timed public execution. But she had no idea what waited behind my gate. Nature itself seemed to take sides that week. A violent storm system rolled through, bringing winds that howled like wounded animals and rain that fell sideways. I watched from my window as Martha's elaborate garden fence, the pristine white pickets she was so proud of, shattered under the assault. Sections flew across her lawn. Her rose trellises collapsed. Her perfectly manicured paradise transformed into wreckage in under an hour. And my garden? My mess of woven metal and deep-rooted wild things? It stood firm. The flexible metal walls bent with the wind, but didn't break. The established vines held everything together like nature's own rope. Even the glass panels survived, protected by strategic placement and sturdy frames. When dawn broke calm and clear, I surveyed my intact sanctuary while Martha stood in her destroyed yard, looking small and defeated among her scattered pickets. Sometimes chaos has more strength than perfection. Sometimes wild things survive where careful things shatter. The inspector arrived on Thursday at exactly 10 o'clock, just as the letter had promised. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with tired eyes and a clipboard that looked well used. And right behind him, like a shadow he couldn't shake, came Martha. She'd clearly been waiting for this moment, dressed in a crisp blazer despite the warm morning, her hair perfect, her expression a mixture of righteous satisfaction and barely concealed glee. This was her victory lap, her vindication. I met them at my front gate wearing work jeans and a smile that I hoped looked more confident than I felt. My heart hammered against my ribs, so hard, I thought they might hear it. "Good morning," I said steadily. "Right this way." I could see Martha's eyes gleaming with anticipation as I reached for the gate latch. She thought she knew what waited on the other side. She thought this inspection would end with citations, fines, maybe even a court order. She had no idea. The gate swung open, and everything changed. Sunlight poured into the space, caught by hundreds of pieces of colored glass and scattered into 1,000 dancing rainbows. The pathway ahead was flanked by walls of woven metal that sparkled with embedded mirrors and glass mosaics, patterns I'd created from broken tiles, forming images of flowers and butterflies. Hanging planters made from old boots and kettles overflowed with cascading blooms in every color. The old fountain I'd repaired sat at the first turn, water trickling over stones I'd painted to look like jewels. And everywhere, flowers burst through unexpected containers. Wine bottles, teacups, even an old chandelier I'd converted into a planter. Butterflies danced between the blooms. Birds sang from hidden perches. The inspector froze in the archway, his clipboard forgotten at his side. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. And Martha gasped, an actual audible gasp of shock that gave me more satisfaction than any insult she'd thrown could have caused pain. I led them deeper into the garden, watching their faces as each turn revealed something new. We passed through the tunnel of vines where dappled sunlight created moving patterns on the ground. We emerged at the mirror garden, the piece I was most proud of. Every available surface held mirrors of different sizes and shapes, all angled to reflect the surrounding flowers and sky. The effect was dizzying and beautiful. You couldn't tell where reality ended and reflection began. The small space looked infinite, stretching into impossible distances. Flowers bloomed 100 times over in the glass. The blue sky multiplied endlessly. And right in the center, positioned as the focal point of this reflected paradise, stood my sculpture. I'd built it from discarded furniture, pieces I'd found on the curb over the years, including several items I recognized from Martha's own trash. I'd transformed them into an abstract figure of a woman made entirely of reclaimed wood and metal, her arms raised to the sky, flowers growing from her open palms. Beauty from discarded things. Purpose from what others considered worthless. The inspector left without issuing a single citation. He shook my hand, said something about extraordinary use of recycled materials and exemplary environmental consciousness, but his words barely registered. I was watching Martha, who stood silently near the gate, her face pale and unreadable. But the story didn't end with the inspection. The next morning, I woke to my phone buzzing nonstop. Notifications flooded in from social media platforms I barely used. Someone, I later learned it was the inspector's college-age daughter, had posted photos of my garden online with the caption, "This woman turned trash into paradise." The post had gone viral overnight. Thousands of shares. Tens of thousands of likes. Comments poured in from around the world. Garden magazines sent messages. A local reporter was already at my door by 8 in the morning, asking for an interview. By noon, 3 different bloggers stood in my garden taking pictures. By evening, the local news van pulled up. My mess had become an overnight sensation. Local woman turns junk into magic. That was how the newspaper headline read the following Sunday. The article included a dozen photos and an interview where I explained my philosophy about finding beauty in unexpected places. The reporter particularly loved the sculpture made from discarded furniture, calling it a powerful statement about society's relationship with waste and worth. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Garden clubs wanted me to speak. Schools asked if I could teach workshops. A lifestyle magazine scheduled a feature article. Influencers posed throughout my garden, their followers flooding my small yard with visitors every weekend. I installed visiting hours and a guest book. Meanwhile, I noticed something. Martha had stopped mowing her lawn. Her garden, usually pristine even after the storm damage, sat neglected. The fallen fence pieces remained scattered. Weeds grew between her famous roses. And she never came outside when visitors filled the street, photographing my garden through the now permanently open gate. The neighborhood dynamic shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. People started remembering things Martha had said about others. Critical comments, passive-aggressive suggestions, the way she'd positioned herself as the arbiter of community standards. Mrs. Lorne, who'd listened to Martha's gossip about my compost heap, approached me at the mailbox one afternoon. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I should have asked to see what you were doing before judging." Others followed. The neighbors who'd signed Martha's petition quietly asked to have their names removed. People who'd avoided me after the city inspector's visit now waved cheerfully and asked about my next project. And Martha? She became the subject of the same whispered conversations she'd once orchestrated about me. Did you know she filed that complaint? She took secret videos of Rebecca's yard. She started that whole petition. Even her closest friend, the woman who'd walked with her every morning, started crossing the street to avoid their usual route. The local paper sent a follow-up reporter for a feature story the following month. She was interested in the human interest angle. What inspired the transformation? We sat on my back porch surrounded by the garden that had become almost famous in our small town. I thought carefully before answering, knowing Martha would read whatever I said, knowing the whole neighborhood would dissect my words. "What inspired this transformation?" the reporter asked, pen poised over her notebook. I smiled, remembering that Tuesday morning at the fence, the laugh that wasn't a laugh, the shame that had brought me to tears. "Someone told me my garden was a mess," I said carefully. During a magazine interview 2 weeks later, a journalist asked about the sculpture's origin, the centerpiece of the mirror garden that everyone wanted to photograph. I hesitated, my hand wrapped around a warm mug of tea, considering how much truth to share. The sculpture was deeply personal, built from pieces I'd collected over months, each one representing something someone had thrown away. But one component had special significance. The ornate headboard that formed the figure's torso came from Martha's curb, discarded during her move-in. She'd considered it trash. I'd made it art. The journalist waited patiently for my answer, probably expecting some profound artistic statement about environmental conservation or creative reuse. Instead, I smiled and said simply, "I made it from the trash someone threw at me." Sometimes the things meant to hurt us become the foundation of our greatest transformations. The journalist's eyes widened. She understood I wasn't just talking about furniture. The article ran with that quote as the pull quote, featured in bold text on the second page. It was the line everyone remembered. Martha finally snapped on a humid Saturday afternoon in late summer. I was showing a group of garden club members through the space when I heard shouting from the street. We emerged to find Martha standing on the sidewalk, her face flushed red, her perfect composure completely shattered. Half the neighborhood had gathered, drawn by the commotion. "You stole my reputation," she screamed, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "Everything I built here, everything I worked for, you destroyed it all with your junk." The words poured out of her in a torrent of rage and hurt. Years of maintaining perfect appearances, of controlling narratives, of being the neighborhood authority, all of it crumbling around her. The garden club members shifted uncomfortably. Neighbors watched in stunned silence. And I stood there, calmer than I'd expected to be, looking at this woman who'd tried so hard to break me. "You gave it to me," I replied softly but clearly. "I didn't take anything from you. I just showed people who I really was. What you lost by trying to destroy someone else." If you've made it this far, don't forget to like and subscribe for more compelling stories like this one. The Homeowners Association held their regular meeting the first Tuesday of September. I attended, curious about the aftermath of everything that had happened. What I heard shocked me more than any of Martha's insults ever had. The board announced that they were voting to feature my garden as a community art installation and model of creative environmental responsibility. They wanted to include photos in the neighborhood newsletter and potentially the HOA website. My eyesore had become the community's pride. But there was more. The board secretary, a stern woman in her 60s, cleared her throat and announced an investigation into unauthorized surveillance concerns. Someone had reviewed Martha's petition package, the one with all those photos of my yard taken from her upstairs window, and determined she'd been filming and photographing neighboring properties without consent for months. Not just my garden. Several neighbors' yards appeared in her collection. The HOA issued an official violation and fine. Martha wasn't at the meeting to defend herself. I later heard she'd left to stay with family in another state. 6 weeks passed before I saw Martha again. Autumn had arrived, painting my garden in new colors, bringing different flowers into bloom. I was pruning roses near the front gate when I heard a soft voice behind me. "Rebecca." I turned to find Martha standing on the sidewalk, looking smaller somehow, less polished. Her hair hung loose instead of in its usual perfect style. She wore simple jeans and a cardigan with a button missing. And in her hands, she held a small clay pot containing a struggling lavender plant, its stems wilted and brown at the edges. She started, then stopped, her eyes filling with tears. "Can you teach me how to make something grow again?" The question hung between us, loaded with meanings beyond gardening. We both knew she wasn't just asking about the plant. She was asking about herself, about recovery, about finding beauty after destruction. I could have turned her away.
Part of me wanted to.
But I looked at that dying lavender, and I thought about transformation, about second chances, about the difference between justice and cruelty. We spent that entire afternoon in the garden together, kneeling in the dirt like children, our hands working side by side in the soil. Mine remains wild and artistic, full of mirrors and mosaics and flowers growing from unexpected places. Hers has softened into something between control and chaos, still structured but gentler now, with space for native plants and volunteer wildflowers she once would have considered weeds. We give tours together, alternating between her space and mine, telling our story of transformation and forgiveness. People come from surrounding towns to see the gardens, but more importantly, to hear how two women turned conflict into friendship, judgment into growth. Sometimes I catch Martha smiling as she shows visitors her lavender, now thriving, sprawling far beyond that original small pot, and I think about how wrong I almost was. I almost became like her, meeting cruelty with more cruelty. Instead, I built something beautiful. And in doing so, I helped her build something beautiful too. Maybe some weeds were meant to bloom after all. Maybe we all are.